the presentation, I wanted just to go through sort of our National Button Society classification of synthetic polymers to talk about how you might, what you might look for if you were thinking about collecting casein buttons, how you might eventually organize a tray for competition, or things you might want to include at least for a competition tray. So we're just going to run quickly through some examples of things that fit into those different categories, starting with, of course, decorative finishes. And I chose these examples of gilt. I think this gray button is interesting because that's almost like an imitation wood grain back there, then filled in with the carved or engraved design filled in with gold. The design here is filled in with silver. This Art Deco clock face or watch face with the outlines of the hands in gilt, and then the little squiggles painted on in gilt to represent the hours. This is one of my very favorite buttons of all time. And as we talked about before, with dye, there is so much you can do with casein. And this is one example of that, where this, the green dye, the dark green dye, has been applied to the surface of the button. And of course, that doesn't penetrate all the way through. It, that makes a nice even color on the surface. But then the surface material has been cut back to reveal the lighter shade to make an interesting geometric pattern. Some other dye techniques. I'm pretty sure this is done with a wax resist dye. The surface of the button would have been dyed pink and then had the wax applied just to make these crosshatch patterns, and then dyed black. Everything on here in white is in paint, actually. Again, another example of wax resist here. The blanks would have, I believe, been marked out with the wax and then filled in with the colors afterwards, after the rest of the surface had been dyed this dark blue color. The yellow border, again, is in paint on the surface. This one I'm a little less sure about. One of my very, very smart button advisors told me that she thought it was also a wax resist, that it would have been the light blue surface would have been applied already with a resist here to make the white. So a first coat of the light blue, and then more wax resist on the light blue to make the dark blue design. I think I didn't get that backwards. I wonder, I mean, clearly the white is a wax resist. Afterwards, whether this is done with another wax resist and more dye, or if it's done with a stencil and paint, because when we look at these larger examples, I believe these were probably done with a stencil and paint. The buttons were dyed green, then the stencil was put on and the black paint was applied rather than a dye with the wax resist. And obviously the fish, I think to get lines this fine, I think that would be hard to do with a stencil. I think that's been painted on probably freehand. And another super interesting paint effect, the buttons were painted in this sort of polka dot pattern. A little spoiler alert, when we get up to the working methods, we'll talk about cane work. And there were these casein, multicolored casein buttons that used rods. Remember, I talked about cutting the rods into beans and then pressing those into a sheet. So these were just all different colored beans pressed into a sheet to make, and then the buttons were sawn out of the sheets. And and a lot of times you do see these cane work buttons with a black laminated top layer that has been cut back to show a design of the cane work. And so I wonder, I mean, because these are very definitely painted and they've got these sort of splotched, dotted color designs, and then with a stencil overlay and painted in black. And I wonder if they were imitating those other buttons or if they just thought this was a nice effect. I don't know. Lots and lots of painted casein buttons in all kinds of designs, parrot, animal life, Egyptian, great paisley pattern. This button is from a series. You can see this one has the letter A and the Sacré-Cœur Basilica in Paris. This was from a whole set that spelled out Paris with paintings of different monuments from Paris. You can see it's even got a little French flag here at the top. You do have to be cautious when you're identifying those because exactly the same thing was done with wooden buttons. A lot, again, because of the popularity of casein, during the 30s. After the war, during the liberation of France, those were the buttons that were available to make wartime commemoratives of the liberation of France. So we have here with the French flag, the British flag, and the two flags together. Definitely a French officer, possibly a British soldier with that flat helmet. The military historian people will tell me for sure, I hope. But again, just these patriotic themes from the wartime era are often associated with casein and also with wooden buttons. Again, talking about that interwar period, there was a World's Fair in Paris, and again in 1937, lots and lots and lots of souvenirs. And here we just have an example of a painted casein button in the shape of a stamp and a buckle, you know, very boldly, you know, Paris 1937. That was the place to be. One last paint effect, which these are very similar to when we're thinking about the classification of shell or pearl buttons. We would call these encrusted, paint encrusted, because on the surface of the button, it's dimensional. It's built up with I believe it's gesso, and then gilt and painted, often in these Asian themes. And so I think this is an interesting example of how those old techniques that would have been used in the 19th or early 20th century on shell buttons, those were in the beginning adapted to the casein buttons. So I would imagine these are relatively early using those techniques. The next example is one I'm not sure of because it's a metallized button. So of course you can't really see the material. What we do see on the back of the button is a typical, remember I mentioned when I was talking about Ardor and their designs, this is the typical Ardor shank that has those 4 claws that are set into the back of the button. Whether or not this is casein, I don't know, but it has that shank. It's contemporary with the casein buttons they were making. It's someday if I find a broken one, I'll know. We also have, so we talked before when we were looking through the sample book, if you managed to stay with me through the whole sample book exposition, we talked about the pearlized plastic effect where it's sort of that marbled look. This is a pearlized surface where this pearlized or pearlescent paint has been painted over the blue buttons. And this one is very similar to that wax resist button. We see that there's been a resist here to make the moon and the reflection in the water. And then, this was probably a lighter blue sky with the boat and the shore picked out in the darker shade of blue, which is, the top layer of the dye on the button. And this other one was just a surface carved, kind of a stylized pine cone and pine needle design. I wonder, given the fact that this pearlized finish is only on the top of the buttons and it's kind of, the application is a little bit sloppy. These could have been old stock that someone tried to gussy up with something new because they hadn't sold. That's a possibility. I've not seen a lot of examples like this. As we've said from the very beginning, casein can imitate just about any material. So we have a few examples of course, because of course in our plastic classification, of course, imitating other materials is something we try to represent. And given the popularity of Asian themes during this Art Deco period, it's not so surprising to see an imitation of carved cinnabar lacquer work, I think. This next one, very finely carved, pierced, and tinted to imitate bone or ivory. And this one, again, with the veining, very typical imitation ivory use of casein. I think this one, again, with this maple seed motif, that was a very popular motif during the Art Nouveau period. So this might be a relatively early carved and pierced buckle. This next piece is just a finding. There's nothing on this. It's not a buckle, it's not a button, it's not a brooch. It's just these different, it's the marquetry of the different kinds of exotic wood with black and white casein in there, to me, imitating ebony and ivory. And so, people my age will be having Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson in their minds for the rest of the evening. You're welcome. As we've said, again, you know, imitation horn, imitation tortoiseshell. This is absolutely the Casein wheelhouse. These are relatively easy to find. These, of course, Casein is always better with a pearl inlay. Those are my favorites, as we'll see in a little bit. Again, going back to those Asian themes that were very popular during the Art Deco period, we have lots of examples of Casein imitating jade, you know, with the veining in here and the carving, the Asian characters, all very typical of the Art Deco period, and Casein imitating other materials. Casein was associated with just about any other material embellishment you can imagine. So we'll run through just a few examples of those. We've got black glass, clear and colored glass in the form of those little beads that are glued in there. This example has pastes that are set in metal, and then that metal piece is mounted into the Casein frame. There are examples where the pastes are directly set into the Casein. I didn't happen to have one of those here that I could photograph for you. Glass finds its way onto Casein also in the form of coralene beads that are painted on. This is another super area for people who like to research. There was an article again in the National Bulletin a few years ago about one sample card of these that was found recently. That this seems to have been a cottage industry, probably again in the 30s, maybe earlier than that, maybe in the 20s. The sample card that we have is from a woman who apparently just did this kind of painting on fabric and on Casein buttons as a little cottage industry for the, and who knows whether she sold those at her local market every week, if she supplied fashion designers or seamstresses. We don't know exactly what the end user was, but she, you know, the people who were doing this kind of work did really beautiful coralline work on Casein. Metal OMEs are abundant with Casein. We have here, this is an Ardor button. It has an aluminum inlay and then a white metal or a silver metal escutcheon. These military themes, the soldier's helmet and the grenade, probably from the interwar period when we were building the Maginot Line to defend ourselves, because we didn't want to have a repeat of World War I. We all know how that ended. This button has a yellow metal inlay, which is less common. We see the aluminum and white metal relatively commonly, but yellow metal not nearly as much. This is a more modern Italian Casein button with the button as an escutcheon. These two examples on either side here are a little unusual because they're rimmed. That's not set in metal, that's just a yellow metal or a white metal rim on there. This copper OME is an unusual one. I've not seen a lot of those. This button is probably an earlier one. We can see the silvered metal flower there is held on with cut steels, which probably would not have been so fashionable after the 1920s. You do find Casein with other plastics. This has a bakelite, a piece of bakelite set into the frame. This one, you can see the iridescence. This is a double cut Casein button. We'll talk a little bit more about that technique in a moment. But so basically there was a channel cut in the back of the button, and then the top of the button was cut to make a pierced pattern. And then this button has on the back, glued on the back, a thin sheet of probably transparent celluloid that's got an iridescent feature on it. So it's almost like an imitation pearl background. As I hinted, shell and Casein is one of my favorite things. I could look at shell and Casein buttons for days. These, it was hard to pick. I chose 4 of my favorite examples, again, all in sort of the Art Deco period, again, with these Asian subjects or the strong geometrics. And here again with aluminum inlays and the shell, and here with 2 different shades of Casein, looking like that rod of shell has been slipped into those wickets there, and some beautiful shell carvings, again, probably from Méru, that have been mounted into Casein frames. Leather OME, this is probably the most typical kind you'll find. It's a sew-through button that's had that strip of leather tied in there to make it into an imitation sew-through. and then the knot on the back makes the shank so that you can sew it on. So it's got a little bit of height off the front of your coat so you can get your thick buttonhole in your thick wool coat over that. This top left button is Italian casein again, very fanciful work with the leather fringe, and this center ring here is movable. That ring moves on the loop, so a very fun button and a very good one to include in a competition tray. This, again, with the Asian character and almost looks like a package tied up with string, but that is a strip of leather on there. We find casein laminated with cork, with a layer of cork in there, which is less common. You do find them, but it's less common. This is the only casein button I've ever seen with a raffia pattern woven on the top. So that, to me, qualifies as very unusual. We see the inlays of wood here. Again, these exotic woods, very popular during the Art Deco period. This is an Ardor button with that typical 4-claw shank and the inlay of wood marquetry. Fabric OME, well, this is cord, of course, worked into the holes. It's really hard to see the black on black. The background behind this yellow metal is wool, so that's a fabric OME. This is another movable button. This casing piece slides out of the loop. This is not in wonderful condition. This was a plastic coated cord, and of course from moving over the past 80 years, most of that plastic coating is gone. Just an example of fabric OME on a buckle, this very fun fez with a fabric tassel. I thought that was a lot of fun. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you, this will take, when I'm teaching my first and second year translation students, I often will have a little break and I'll say, well, it's Uncle Matthew's story time now. So this is going to be the Uncle Matthew's story time portion of my presentation. And with the moral of the story, I'll tell you the moral of the story before we even start. It's always good to look at things a second and a third and a fourth time, because you do eventually, you know, maybe I'm just a little slow, but eventually the light bulb will go off. So you can see I've labeled this button as a fabric OME, and you're saying, I'm sure, at home, where's the fabric? And I looked at this button at least 5 times before I brought it home, because every time it was at one of my favorite dealers at the Clignancourt flea market in Paris, who has all of her buttons in those clear, hard plastic shoe boxes. If you're my age, again, if you're my age, you remember those. Your mom had her Sunday shoes in those in the closet. This dealer in Paris has all of her good buttons in those clear plastic shoe boxes behind a curtain. If you don't know they're there, you miss them entirely. If you know they're there, you say, oh, could you please let me look at your buttons? And she's delighted to spend a morning looking at buttons and chatting. And so, and of course, I always go through the Casein button shoebox. And I looked at this button, as I said, 4, 5, 6 times every week, because I have to confess, I used to arrange my teaching schedule at the university to have Monday mornings free so that I could go to the flea market in Paris. I did that for a lot of years. And so I would go almost every week, and every week look in the Casein button shoebox, and every week look at this button and say, this is weird and wrong and not attractive, and put it back. And finally, must have been a slow morning, I looked at it a little more closely and looked at what it said. And it says, breveté SGDG, of course, in French, basically patent pending. So I thought, why would someone patent this button? And then I started looking and was like, well, this shank, this is just weird and wrong. This doesn't make any sense. Then the light bulb finally went off. It unscrews. The shank screws off the back, and so the disc on the top of the button comes out so that you can add your own fabric OME and have a custom button to go with your coat. And and of course, I like any kind of mechanical button that moves and comes apart and does stuff. So I was thrilled. After rejecting this without giving it a second thought for at least a month, maybe 6 weeks, every week I would look at it and put it back. Then I was thrilled to have it when I finally was smart enough to figure out why it was interesting. So as I said, the moral of the story is give it a second look and you might get a good surprise. Now, I mentioned these buttons before. We're moving on to the working techniques. I believe I've got the terminology here right. I've called this cane work because it's, as I explained, it's the little pieces of casein that are pressed flat, and when you turn these over, they're the same front and back. It's not, maybe not the kind of swirled patterns or flower patterns we think of typically as being cane work, but I don't know how else I would describe this. And these are some of my favorite. I think I've said about 3 things are my favorites now, but I really do like just the bright, vibrant colors of these and the fact that they're all a little bit different. And again, and so these, as I said, these were pressed into a sheet and cut out. Obviously the button in the middle was extruded as a rod with the different colored beans and then just cut into sections. Lots of different cut on face techniques. And I have to confess that for this presentation, kind of discovered the synthetic polymer classification. That was not one of my main interests in collecting. And so I had to learn the vocabulary. And just to remind myself, a cut on face button is anything that is worked with any kind of cutting tool, and that can include even a needle. And so here on the left, we see probably, a very simple cut design, just these cutouts to make the geometric pattern. This one was really hard to photograph because you can just about see there are cutouts. The surface is just sliced off, 3 times on the outside and 3 times on the inside, which results, and this casein has been dyed in the first step of the process, so the color is even all the way through. But of course, when you cut off the surface, you get a nice pattern of matte and shiny. The places that have been cut are matte because the polished part has been cut off. These are various carving techniques. We see another interesting stylized pine cone and pine needle design, just, a nice turnover pattern, a nice curved line pattern, just a few more different cut on the face designs. This one, the crab here, again, hilarious button, I think. To me, it looks like poker work or pyrography. Whether or not that was how it was done, I don't know. It could also, I suppose, just have been carved and then tinted to imitate pyrography. But I mean, when you look at the little points here, it does look like something hot was put in there. Same thing, again, on this Art Deco Asian themed button. You've got all of these little petals are outlined with some kind of needle, a hot needle, or some kind of carving tool. And just to finish up, a delightfully carved buckle with a bee design. The next technique is this, as I mentioned before, the double cut, where there's a channel cut out on the back, and then the front of the button is cut to reveal the openings in the button, so we get a pierced pattern. You can see there's this left side of the sample card is the double cut. These are just face cut. That one has an inlay. Cute, interesting, everyday buttons, I would say. Now, I already said I had to talk a little bit more about shell because with casein, one of the very, very frequently used techniques was inlays, and of course, I'm particularly drawn to the shell inlays. I promise you, I tried to keep this to a minimum. I think there are 3 slides of shell buttons. I mean, if you look at this fabulous piece of abalone shell mounted into, this is dark purple. Again, it looks almost black in the slide. Very impressive combination of the synthetic and the natural material. Again, black and white Art Deco geometric designs. These are interesting because it kind of comes back to that conflict of working with natural materials and working with synthetic polymers. And the people who made these buttons wanted us to think that the shell inlay was done and then the carving was done. But when we look really closely, we see that the lines don't quite match up ever. They're just a little bit off. And even on this button. And that makes perfect sense because, as I explained before, you can't work shell and casein at the same time, or the casein catches on fire. So the shell workers did their part on one side, the casein workers did their part, and the two were brought together. I'm really sorry, I'm gonna have to take a drink of water quickly. Excuse me. Moving on, away from the shell, it's hard for me to let it go. Metal is also, as I mentioned, another, we find quite frequently metal inlays, again, in very strong Art Deco patterns. This card of buttons is kind of like that old game on Sesame Street where one of these things is not quite like the others. You know, I'll give you a minute to play along at home and see if you can figure out which one is different and why it's different. There are a couple of interesting things. This button here at the bottom doesn't look particularly exciting at first, but this is a rimmed example, and we've got the two metals, the white metal or aluminum inlay, and then a brass or yellow metal rim on that. I like this one, I think it's interesting. It's got this hole cut out, and then the aluminum strip is laid over that to make the sew-through portion of the button. So I've given you a few seconds. I'm sure this object was the one that was screaming out to you as the one that's different from everything else. We can see that it's, you know, the inlays are etched. It's got two different metal inlays. It's much more elaborate work. And that's because it's a much earlier piece. This is actually, I lost my cursor again. This actually is not a button, it's a stud. So probably from, again, probably maybe even pre-World War I, so from the very early days of casein production. So that's our odd man out on this card. Casein inlays within casein. I mean, if we look at the construction, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 separate pieces of casein laid into the casein to make one button. This one, again, I think this one just impresses me with the precision of cutting all of these concentric rings to make them inlays into this button. I think they're amazing. And finally, I said I was done with the pearl. I lied. We find quite commonly a combination of casein inlays and pearl inlays. And this one even has little strips of metal inlaid to accentuate the design. And now I think I can promise, no, I'm not quite done with pearl. There'll be more pearl. Another technique that's quite commonly used with casein that we've already mentioned is laminating. Many different techniques were used. Mostly the common thing was to, and these are examples with two layers. So the top layer would be cut back to reveal the color of the bottom layer. We can see this is like a pearlized gray laid over sort of a sky blue, and then cut back to show that design. This one is two different shades of purple, you know, cut back and then pierced on the back to have this open work design around the central triangle. Just lots of interesting color combinations and designs. Here are some more examples of laminates. These are all with 3 layers. These have 5 layers, except for this large button at the bottom, which is 7 layers. I thought that had to be the most that was possible. And I was just looking through Hazel Page's book about casein production in Great Britain. And she has a button with 9 layers. But, you know, these multi-layer buttons are quite impressive. I think. I just think about the technical prowess that went into making those. And I do have this one more example with shell. I've looked at this button a lot, and to me, it looks like this layer of white pearl is laminated onto the layer of imitation horn here. I'm, again, not an expert on the technical side of things, but that's what it looks like to me. As I mentioned at the very beginning, casein can be worked like wood, and it means that molding casein is not easy and was not done a lot. And I was not going to even talk about it until I got Hazel Page's book, and there was this button that I had in my drawer that was shallow molded by pressing it with a high heat and a lot of pressure into a mold. And so I had this button and I had that description from Hazel Page, and then I saw a couple of things that that identified this set of buttons, because this is from a set that includes Shakespeare, Elizabeth I, Britannia, and I think one other person I'm forgetting right now. And so I had Hazel Page saying casein, and I had another source saying amino resin or something different. I went to the Big Book of Buttons, definitely says molded casein. However, Elizabeth Hughes in the Big Book of Buttons disagrees with Hazel Page about when and why these buttons were made. Hazel Page says the Festival of Britain in 1951. Elizabeth Hughes said it was for the 400th anniversary of the incorporation of Stratford upon Avon, which would make a lot of sense for William Shakespeare and Elizabeth I. I'm less sure about the connection with Britannia, but you know, button makers didn't always have to make sense in what they were making. Another technique we've mentioned briefly before is piercing. This button is pierced. It's very, very thick, so you can't really see all the way through it. And these buttons, some of these buttons, I mean, this obviously is more robust, more sturdy. These buttons with the large cutouts can be very fragile, and so we don't always find a lot of those. I thought this was very interesting because when, you know, so far when I've mentioned the Asian designs from the Art Deco period, we've seen mostly Far Eastern designs, you know, Chinese or Japanese. With the swastika here, I think this is a more Indian influenced design. But again, a very nice example of the elaborate pierced work with casein. And as is this fabulous salamander buckle with some paint DF. The final portion of our synthetic polymer classification talks about shapes. So we'll just run through a few examples of those very quickly. I don't have tons of things to say about shapes. Those are pretty self-explanatory to all collectors. We've got our linear shapes. Of course, I had to have the M for Matthew. Contoured shapes, we can see again using the rods, and this is carved. My photo is not great of this one. It's carved duck on this ball-shaped button. This button is quite interesting with the casein sort of half sphere, then with this metal cage put over it. I think it's very unusual. These are two pieces of casein that are slotted. The red piece is slotted into the white piece with the sewing hole. Oh, there's another one with pearl that managed to find its way in here. You know, the probably pyrography work to make the design on this one, a laminated one. So again, we've got all the different techniques represented in these contour shapes. And some of the most fun casein buttons are the realistic shapes. And again, these have any range. I mean, you've got the basket here is pierced, as is this hank of rope that has a face cut design. All of these have face cut designs.